Okay, I'm John Quarterman. I'm the Swanee River Keeper. That's a project and a staff position with WWALS Watershed Coalition, Inc., two W's, WWALS Watershed Coalition, Inc. WWALS have been around since 2012. I've been doing this Swanee River Keeper thing since December 2016, trying to keep the waters clean in the 10,000 square miles of the Swanee River Basin in Georgia and Florida. And we do this thing called WWALS webinars, where we have interesting talks by experts in their field. And one of our events committee members, Haley Hall, who is herself a geologist, will now introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you to our speaker, Dr. Matt Cohen, who is the director of the UF Water Institute and a professor in the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatics Sciences at UF, and an eco-hydrologist with nearly 20 years of experience addressing water resource and ecosystem science challenges in Florida and around the world. Dr. Cohen received his PhD from UF in 2003 and joined faculty in 2006 and has led research on hydrological restoration of the Everglades and Big Cypress, the changing ecological state of Florida springs, the deep links between forests and water, and the changing patterns of Arctic and Antarctic stream functions. This work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, all 5 water management districts, and the Department of Environmental Protections and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and has resulted in over 120 publications. Thank you very much for joining us today, Matt. Dr. Cohen's work on water yield was first introduced to Quarterman and I at the Swanee River Board Management meeting. And it's just really interesting stuff that has pretty immediate practicality for so many landowners in Florida, I think. And I think I'm really interested to see this be more disseminated to the public. In essence of kind of keeping things going, I'm going to encourage everybody to stay on mute and put any questions you have in the chat. And then we'll maybe have time to ask a few during, but we'll save time at the end for questions. And let's go ahead and get going. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Haley and John. I see some familiar faces. David and Wendy have heard a lot of this before. There may be a couple new slides. John and Haley have both seen exactly this presentation because I decided that both in the interests of being expeditious, but also somewhat transparent about what was presented at the governing board meeting a couple weeks ago, that like this audience might want to see exactly what I shared with them. And so unchanged entirely. And so what I want to talk about today is work that we've starting to wrap up, sort of the final versions of this. And it's work that's had sort of a long legacy. In fact, long collaboration with David is sort of the centerpiece of the projects over the last sort of 10 or so years. And it really is the notion that the water supply planning question in any place, but especially the coastal plain of the United States, is a question that's manageable, right? Based on how we think about land cover, and in particular, how we think about forest density. And so insofar as forests could be managed differently, are there opportunities to mobilize water for other purposes, whether that's to recharge an aquifer that's depleted elsewhere, to make water available for consumptive use permittees, to restore systems that are suffering from insufficient flows. And so I think it's part of an integrated solution set. And what we've been trying to do, really under the auspices of a project with Swanee River, but you can see a lot of partners down there on the bottom, is to understand and quantify that effect of, as we manage forests differently. We're talking specifically about pine forests, the pines and lines that are so ubiquitous across North Florida. What are the opportunities that are generated in terms of ecosystem services of water yield? And I'll define all of those things in a second, but I want to just acknowledge very quickly that the Swanee River District has been a champion of this idea since the beginning. Really, the sort of first version of this, the back of the napkin calculation, was back in 2012. Suwannee District was at the table then. They were Bob Hickey, who was the land manager for the district for a long time, was the engine behind getting a large project funded that David Kaplan was a collaborator on. Funded ultimately by all 5 water management districts. So I just want to give them props for thinking about this as an integrative solution space. The idea has also gotten traction with the Florida Forest Service, with NCASI, who is the industry research arm of forest industry across the country. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, who's actually funding a little piece of this as well. And a huge shout out to Rainier, whose land it was that we have done this massive 30,000 acre experiment from which we're learning things about how forest management affects the water budget in North Florida flatwoods. There's other groups that have been involved, the Lateral Conservation Trust and North Florida Land Trust, and the Department of Energy, who's currently funding some of our work out there. And so, like any project, there's sort of a cocktail of different entities that have expressed interest in the outcome. And so that is sort of the shout out to all of them. And I am happy, by the way, to have questions asked at any point during the meeting. And so if you have a question, raise your hand, please feel free to do so. This feels like it should be, definitely could be informal. I also want to thank a bunch of people who did all the work, because of course I'm mostly sitting where you're looking at me right now, editing papers and looking at data. And so there was a lot of stuff that was installed in the woods to make this project happen. I want to shout out a couple people in particular, but Josh Epstein, who's shown in the upper right there, who's been my lab manager for a long time. And he and Jules, who he's right next to, they were the ones who basically installed an enormous amount of equipment in the woods to make this possible. And then James Mays, who's in the bottom right there, has done a lot of the work that I'll present, the analysis work. But there's a whole host of people that make a lab a fun place to be. And this is not working like I had hoped it would. Here we go. All right, so what I'm going to talk a little bit about is first the background of this idea, water yield from Florida's forests. I want to talk a little bit about a century of change. We basically can use historical flow data and historical aerial imagery to reconstruct the history of forest cover in the Bradford Forest and the Upper Santa Fe River. Share with you a tool that we've built to talk about how you could predict water yield from different forested settings. Spend some time talking about some responses. So we did this massive experiment across the Bradford Forest tract owned by Rainier. You can see some pictures of the instrumentation and equipment that we deployed. And we basically were able to track the water budget response in 2 different settings. One is the embedded wetlands, depressional wetlands that are all around this landscape, and how they respond to having the forests adjacent to them thinned or harvested. And then by extension, the water yield responses in streams, and then close with some recommendations. And these were recommendations that, again, were structured for the governing board, but I think they are recommendations that we feel like are quite portable and of interest to you guys as well. So to start with this notion of the water yield, I mean, we're basically doing some math on the water budget. Mass is conserved, right? And so over long time scales, the input of water to a watershed in terms of precipitation is balanced by the discharge Q and the evapotranspiration. So if that has to be true. And when we think about the water that we use for everything other than growing things, so water that is municipal supply, industrial supply, environmental supply, is all that Q. That's all of the water that's left over from after evapotranspiration has essentially gotten its tax, and we call that water yield. And so if we think about water yield as the sum of all the Qs, all the various groundwater and surface water discharge pathways, precipitation minus evapotranspiration is how we would define that. And just to like put a stamp on that, that is all the water that we use. Every drop that is issued in a consumptive use permit is water that's left over from raindrops that were not evaporated. And so this cartoon that says, hey, listen, we don't know that much. Actually, we know a lot. And what we're trying to do is to make that what we know sort of actionable for the complicated decision spaces that are out there about water supply planning and by extension, water quality. This is a quite infamous paper. It was actually published in Nature in 2019 and subsequently retracted for reasons unrelated to this amazing graphic. But basically what we know from many, many centuries, really, of understanding how forests and water interact is that as we reduce forest cover, we increase water yield by lowering evapotranspiration. There's some records during battles, in ancient Greece where they noted that as they harvested the woods, springs that had previously not flowed would start flowing. And so this notion that there's this interrelationship between the vegetation and the water that is left over, that is filling streams and aquifers and making springs flow and all that, is not new information. And this particular graphic is a global synthesis that suggests that when we remove forest cover, we almost uniformly see a positive water yield response. In other words, the water yield response is somewhere between 40 and 80% to the broad notion of deforestation when we afforest, which is to say take land that was previously unforested and plant forests, we see a negative water yield response. And so it is true that trees are consumers of water, but that relationship is somewhat contentious and local, and understanding how the forest density, how many trees are planted, and the subsequent impact on water yield is actually not that clear, and I think is a super important knowledge constraint for any kind of operational utilization of this idea. So if we deforest, we could make more water yield, make more water available is a useful notion in principle, but in practice you need to know how much, because you're obviously needing to incentivize people to make different land management decisions on their land. And so it's also true that it's not always desirable to increase water yield because there are flood and storage risk issues that might be exacerbated if you make more water supply available. This is one of the reasons why urbanization and the loss of canopy cover and making the landscape impervious is undesirable, because we don't want all the additional water. It's also true that in many settings, particularly like in the interior continental rainfall system of the Amazon, if you cut down the trees, you actually impede the rainfall in the interior of that system. And so these continental systems of rainfall recycling, if you starve the atmosphere of moisture, you have other negative consequences. And so I don't want this to be too Pollyannish that this is the solution to all our water supply problems. But in peninsular Florida, where there are intensive pine stands growing, this is, I think, quite a realistic and useful approach to thinking about water supply. The first study that we did was with a colleague of mine, Daniel McLaughlin, who's now up at the Virginia Tech, and David Kaplan, who's on this call. And for roughly $5,000, we calculated what we thought would be the water supply consequences of thinning plantation forests. And what we found was a number that, again, cost us $5,000. We published that number, and that number has been pretty stable ever since, but there's some customized numbers that we were interested in getting. So for $500,000, a subsequent project, every water management district and the Department of Ag and Consumer Services supported a project that took a statewide perspective on this, where we thought about how different silvicultural treatments would result in additional water yield. And we put a lot of wires in the woods, 36 plots across the state, where we tried to understand the consequences of different forest prescriptions, different densities, different management schemes, even different species, including fire, and the consequences for the water budget. And that culminated in a whole lot of data, somewhere on the order of 60 million soil moisture measurements over 4 years. And from that, we were able to establish what we sort of already knew, but we now know better, which is that the density of the forest, in particular the leaf area index, which I'll come back to a little bit later, but the density of the forest is a strong driver about how much evaporation happens, right? And so a dense forest like the one on the left is evaporating on the order of 3 millimeters a day, small amount. It's a little bit over a tenth of an inch a day. The forest on the right, which is a much more open stand, is evaporating less, 2.2 millimeters per day. And that's because there's less straws down into the shallow aquifer that are utilizing the water resources that are underground, that are put there by recharge when it rains. And so that is essentially the ecological hydrological tax that's imposed by Florida's ecosystems, right? And so if we take all of the raindrops, and the pie charts on the bottom are all of the raindrops, and we apportion them between those raindrops that go up a tree stem and are evaporated into the atmosphere, 92% of the raindrops follow that path. Only 8% of them are left over to fill up the shallow aquifer, to contribute to headwater streams, to support the hydrological function of wetlands, and ultimately to recharge the Floridan aquifer and flow on to the sea. Small proportion of those data, of those raindrops. If we alter the ET from what sounds like a very small number, 2.9 millimeters a day, to an even smaller number, 2.2 millimeters per day, it doesn't sound like that big an effect, but when we do the full water budget, the proportion of the pie, all those raindrops that turn into water yield, is dramatically enhanced. And so we can, with that very small change, we can increase by nearly a factor of 4 the amount of water that's recharged to all those other familiar uses, stream flow and Floridan aquifer recharge. And so with a small change in forest cover, there's potentially a quite substantial hydrological benefit downstream. The project that I described, where we did all those soil moisture measurements, culminated in this model where we can, based on a couple of properties of the forest stand, its density and its hydrogeological context and its climate, we can make a quite robust prediction about how much water yield arises. So on the x-axis is the model predictions, on the y-axis are our direct measurements of water yield, and you can see we do a pretty good job. There's some residual variation, but we're quite proud of that. And the key thing there is that this model is very simple, and it enables predictions to be made more or less anywhere, which is a useful thing when we're thinking about supporting large water management decisions and water supply planning decisions. And so in particular, this model depends on only 3 things. It depends on the water table depth, which is something we can know everywhere. It's really a categorical variable. It's either deep or shallow. The aridity, which is something that we track from multiple different climate databases. This is not something where we need to take new measurements. These are existing data. The aridity index is a ratio of the atmospheric demand for water and divided by precipitation. So the bigger that number is, the more arid the year is. And then the last thing, which is this first unit here, which is the leaf area index, which is, if you think about taking every leaf in the forest and projecting it down onto the ground, what is the surface area of the leaves per unit area of ground? That's what leaf area index is. It's a unitless quantity. A typical forest like the one that you're looking at on the left there probably has a leaf area index on the order of 3 or 3.5. So that's 3.5 square feet of leaves per square foot of ground. The forest that I showed you previously, that low density stand, is probably closer to 1 or even 0.5 square feet per square foot of ground. So leaf area index becomes one of the factors that controls how much water yield happens. And critically, in this paper, this Acharya et al. Paper, we note that every unit of LAI you reduce in this model increases the water supply recharge to somewhere, not necessarily the Floridan aquifer, but to the ground, becoming water that's made available to the conveyance system that takes water to wetlands and to springs and to the sea. Increases, so every unit that we reduce LAI increases that recharge quantity by nearly 4 inches per year. So given that the average recharge across many of our spring sheds is about 12 inches per year, this is quite a substantial effect. The magnitude of this effect, even though it might sound quite small, is actually substantial. And it speaks to the prospective management importance of forest density on regional water supply. And so that number, I want to sort of just anchor that number for you for later, is that a unit LAI reduction, and remember, LAI is unitless, it doesn't have a unit. So a pine stand of 3.5 taken from 3.5 to 2.5 would, by our estimates, increase recharge by about 4 inches per year. So just to put that in a little more context, the Worthington Springs Basin, which is the basin over which we call the Upper Santa Fe, is about 575 square miles. It's greater than 50% pine forest. Most of the other, not 50%, is lakes and wetlands. And so if we were to lower leaf area index over all the eligible forests in the Worthington Springs Basin, which is about 270 square miles of forest, we would yield about 50 million gallons per day of additional water. That's a big number. I put that number in the context of the Water Management District Governing Board. I put that number as an adjacent number to the Water First North Florida prospective numbers, which is moving about 40 million gallons per day. And so when we think about the magnitude, the prospective magnitude of this, and I don't think there's any realistic universe in which we're going to lower leaf area index across every forest in the Worthington Springs Basin, but there are a lot of forests there, and 50 million gallons per day is a useful number to carry around as the relative magnitude of the potential water supply consequences of this approach to water supply planning versus other approaches. How would you get to a forest that is a production forest? Like there's a landowner that seeks to make revenue from their forest to sell timber or sell timber products. How would you do that in the context of lowering LAI? Well, there would be a remuneration, right? They're foregoing some market value by planting trees at lower densities or for shorter rotations or at delaying the planting. All of those are economic costs. They would have to be paid for. The pricing of those payments, I think, is something that David and Wendy have thought deeply about. And I think it's one of those things where those numbers are not far from what's realistically possible. How a landowner does it, I think, is not up to us, shouldn't be up to us. It should be up to the landowner. And there are many different ways that the landowner could envision lowering the density of their forests. But in particular, one that came from the forest community, the forest production community, is that they could delay planting. Typically, they will clear cut, harvest, and then they'll plant a year later after bedding the land to facilitate baby pine trees being outplanted. They would be willing to wait 2 or 3 years even after that. And so that water yield alone, waiting for, instead of 1 year, waiting 2 extra years, so 3 years would, if you delay the planting, so over a normal rotation with 2 thinnings, you'd get about 19.5 inches of water yield. If you delay the planting, you get nearly 21 inches. And if you did that over half the forest, and this is a very easy operation to implement, the foresters would have to change nothing about their operational planning other than to wait several years. That alone would generate on the order, we estimate, of 8 million gallons per day. And so it's quite easy when you think about large footprints of things like forest cover to get to numbers that are meaningful from a water supply planning perspective. All of these are a little bit, we'll come back to sort of how this would happen and what are some of the operational details for how it would work. But I just wanted to give you the notion that there's a lot of water in the woods. And this is something that we can, I think, lean into as a tool in the toolkit of water supply planning. So if all that works, and I can give you numbers already, the question of why there was a new project, I think, is worth asking. And the particular question that Bob Hickey, who was the real engine behind this project, was trying to get an answer to that he didn't. Sorry, I just saw a question come into the chat that said reducing tree populations and leaf duff will increase the water supply. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm not entirely sure why it would seem counterintuitive. Trees are massive users of water. So we can, if you want to elaborate, I'm happy to pause and try to make that clearer. What was that, Jody Boas question? So when you think about forest health, you think about more trees necessarily? Is that
Yeah. So I was thinking that a forest is composed of trees and that over time it develops a healthy soil system. That's basically like a decomposition cycle. And I can see that, that without trees and soil, the water will evaporate quicker. But is that like an overall good health for an ecological region, or is that deforestation?
well, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is, I'll inject a little nuance into the notion there that it's either a dense forest with as many pine trees as we can pack into an acre versus a clear cut where nothing is growing. And I think there's lots of ecological solutions in between. And I think when we think about forest health, and particularly when we think about restoring some of the forests that used to be quite prevalent in North Florida, in particular the longleaf pine forests, that now are, occupy 2% of their historical range, the density of trees in those historical forests was like substantially lower than modern pine forests.
Right. It's like tree farming is creating a separate and different ecosystem altogether than a naturally occurring like old growth forest, which we have no more of. I just feel like it's almost like introducing an invasive species, the tree farm, and and deforesting the natural what's left. Like it seems like an argument to cut down remaining natural forests. You see what I'm saying? And then to what do you say? Like turn it into money, economize it, whatever that is.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, what we're proposing is that places that are currently managed for timber production, which by the way are, if you think about like integrated water management and you wanted to manage for water quality, timber production stands are by far the best productive land use on the landscape. And so I don't want to impugn the production forestry enterprise. It generates a lot of jobs. It generates a lot of important products that we all use. And they're not invasive species. All of the species that are planted out in those are native, but there are.
No, I wasn't saying the tree was invasive. I was saying that the tree farm is kind of like a new species. I mean, it's not a species at all. It's a tree farm. Right. It's a farm, but it's being put on land that is no longer in its original native, diverse ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, it's like any human land use, it is appropriating land that used to be something else. And those forests are, for the right incentive structure, those forests could be managed differently. And I think that's really the core of the question here is what would be the water benefits and what would be the foregone forest production benefits and how do we balance those? And I think that's really sort of the centerpiece of the conversation. And so, but I do think it's quite clear that forest density is an important control on the evaporative loss process and thereby on the water yield process. The question, just to go back to the presentation here now, is that, to what extent can we expect, when we set an MFL for a water body, we set it at a particular gauge, right? So the Ishtuckney gauge is at the 2500 USGS station, or the 2700 USGS station. The Santa Fe, Lower Santa Fe is at the 2500 USGS station. The question is, when we manage the woods 50 miles upstream, do we reasonably expect that the water that we might yield there would actually end up at the gauge? Because if it doesn't, and all it does is rehydrate the wetlands along the way, and the wetlands are major water users, right? The evaporation from wetlands is really rapid. Does that mean that water never shows up? And so that ends up being a really important part of the conversation. And so we wanted, Bob Hickey in particular, wanted to get an answer to that, whether the estimates that we make, which are sort of at the point scale, at the individual stand scale, does it end up in the places where we want it to show up in a way that would justify the compensation of a landowner. If we're not actually fixing the problem at the place where we're diagnosing the problem, then that won't work. And so,
yeah, it just seems so counterintuitive to me that I feel like it's like changing the ecosystem dramatically by removing the natural occurring diversity. And I mean, it's okay it just feels like it would be co-opted into a reason to cut down an old growth forest. That the natural function of a tree is to hold water there in the place where it is, and let the leaf dander to, that water slowly will seep back into the aquifer. So removing it all seems like a flood risk. It seems like, it seems like killing trees.
Well, I mean, yes, it would be removing trees, but I think the critical point here is that the lands that would be most eligible to confer this benefit would be lands where tree densities are very high. And so we might be quite interested already in reducing tree densities because a lower density forest supports an understory of diverse herbaceous material. It supports gopher tortoises and red cockaded woodpeckers and the prescription of fire. Like when we think about forest restoration, in most cases, what we're thinking about is reducing the density from existing stands to what is more similar to the way that North Florida and the southeastern coastal plain looked historically. Those forests were very low density. And so I think that's a really important point, is that this idea of reducing forest density conferring on hydrological benefit is a win-win, because when we think about forest restoration in general, that's already what we're doing, is trying to reduce the density of the forest to enable the forest to look more like it did under sort of pre-development conditions. And so I don't think if you take away that the suggestion is we should be, removing forests and putting in parking lots, then, that is true. A parking lot has a much higher water yield than basically any ecosystem, but that's certainly not what we're advocating. It's really sort of in the space between existing high density plantation forests and lower density forests of any stripe. And the evidence that is actually confers the benefit, I think, is quite unequivocal. As I've said, and as I'll show again, I think it's, as we reduce forest density, we do generate a water quantity benefit. And I'd like to make the case that is an additional water quality benefit, because every drop that comes out of any forest is high quality water. Our benchmark streams, our best streams, are very often draining industrial silvicultural land, like intensively managed pine stands, because those places have been routinely shown to sustain very high quality water. And so I think that's an important point, that like keeping the land in forest and not converting it to something else, even if that's even if that is a payment to a landowner, ends up having multiple benefits: habitat benefits, water yield benefits, but also water quality benefits. And in the end, I mean, the whole point of this research was, can we generate enough confidence in the relationship between forest density and water yield to create something resembling an incentive program, a payment for ecosystem services? And so that's really the project that I want to talk about here today, which is this a couple things here related to building confidence in this relationship between forest density and the hydrology. So what we set up is this is the upper Santa Fe River Basin. You can see Lake Sampson for those of you who know the basin quite well. This is the new river right here. This is the upper Santa Fe. This is land owned almost entirely by Rainier in Bradford County, about 30,000 acres. We've instrumented about 11 streams where we have continuous discharge records of those streams over the last, really since 2021. And we have 50 wetlands that we've instrumented. These wetlands are embedded in different parts of the landscape. They are different sizes. They have sort of different habitat. And the idea is that we can use these places as an observatory to track what happens when this large, well-equipped landowner can make decisions about where they do their silvicultural treatments. And so in the context of the minimum flows and levels program, specific to the upper Santa Fe Basin, but I would argue for basically anything in North Florida, can we think about how ET management might be part of the solution set for those quite challenging problems? And we've done a lot. We've tracked the water table, we've measured forest structure, we've done a lot of satellite remote sensing, we've even measured some water quality, we've thought about the structure of the land and the topography, and there's a bunch of pieces of a hydrologic observatory that were, super exciting. But I want to say again, like would have been impossible without the collaboration with Rainier, because they're the ones with the harvesters, and they're the ones who own the land, and they're the ones who are able to sort of engineer an experiment for us so that we can study the effects of that. So we are in the phase of writing the final report. We've established these measurements. We've got gauging on 10 streams, 50 wetlands, 100 locations. We've done some experimental harvesting across lots of these landscapes that allows us to do an experiment where in one place we did some forest density reduction, other place we didn't. We've done a lot of GIS work to enable ourselves to visualize these relationships. We've measured the forests quite intensively, learned how to detect forest structure from space. We've done a lot of thinking about ditches. Ditches are quite important in this landscape. They were all in study. This whole landscape was ditched back in the 1970s, and this idea, ditch restoration, I think, is a very viable and useful part of thinking about North Florida, like a restoration trajectory for North Florida. And we've built a bunch of models. And so I want to share with you some of this stuff today. And I want to start, and I said this before, but I want to just make this point again, is that anything that we think about forest recharge has the ancillary benefit of improving water quality, because every additional drop of water from North Florida's forests is improving the water quality situation elsewhere. So basically, when we look across the state at all of the benchmark streams, these are the streams that have the best water quality. These are mostly small headwater streams. All of them were in forested watersheds. And those forested watersheds it is impossible to discriminate the water quality between places that drain the sort of preservation forests. So we think about or forests that are really minimally intensively managed versus forests that are more intensively managed for economic productivity. The water quality from them is indistinguishable. And I think this is a super important point, that when we think about what the allies are with regard to meeting regional water quality challenges, forest management should be viewed as part of the solution set. And yes, the forests do use fertilizer and herbicide. We tested the fertilizer application at 4 times the best management practice application rate, and we're unable to detect any additional nitrogen or phosphorus coming out in these 2 streams, this black one here and this open circle here. So these streams were intensively managed, and we've published about that. And so yeah, I'm an advocate for the water quality benefits of even pines and lines. It is far better than essentially any other land cover that we're prepared to consider. This is a synthesis across a lot of different studies, but we look at managed forests. These are timber production stands. This is companies that are traded on the stock market, REITs, right? Like their objective is not to meet water quality goals. Their objective is to pay their shareholders. And yet the event mean concentrations in managed forests with respect to both total phosphorus and total nitrogen are far better than basically any other land use that we might see across North Florida's landscape. And so to the extent that the business model for managed forests is under assault from a whole bunch of global to local challenges, a lot of the companies are selling their land. And to me, this is a huge issue that is going to manifest as degraded water quality as we move from managed forests into other land uses. This is summary for the spring shed of Silver River. You can see forested, this is so nitrogen loading to the Floridan aquifer, measured as the concentration in the Floridan aquifer. You can see under forest and rangeland settings, the nitrogen loads are very, very low. So this is how we conserve both our surface water quality and our subsurface water quality. And so, and if simultaneously we can manage those lands to enable additional water supply, then all the better. So forest management works, y'all. The other thing to say in service of background is that the upper Santa Fe River water budget has been quite dramatically shifted. If we plot cumulative rainfall on the x-axis and cumulative discharge at Worthington Springs on the y-axis for the now 94 years of the data record, what you can see is a largely stationary effect for the first roughly, there's no time on this graph, but this corresponds to roughly the first 80 years, 75 years of the record. And then a new hydrological regime that's established right here around this data point. Where is that? That works out to like the late 1990s, around 1998. So what we have is essentially a stationary climate signal that translates into a very different flow generating regime over the last 25 years. And this is not ostensibly because of pumping, because this is the superficial aquifer. There's a longer story to tell that I think does connect this to Floridan aquifer use. But this is a huge problem because it means that the system that we're managing in the upper Santa Fe Basin is very much in violation of the spirit of a minimum flow and level. And you can see that in the drop off here. We're missing over the last 25 years somewhere on the order of 3 meters of water, given that the average runoff from the basin is about 20 centimeters. We're missing more than half of the water that we would have expected to come out at the Worthington Springs gauge than we've seen. And it's in that context that I think that in particular, the forest management feedback that we could think about incentives to landowners in the upper Santa Fe Basin to remedy this, I think is an important consideration. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and skip a lot of this. One of the things that we did early on is reconstruct what we think forest cover looked like over the last 100 years, and this is what it looked like in the 1930s, very open, sparse canopy. You can see it's a little hard to see when you zoom in, but we did a deep interrogation of the old aerials that started back in the 1930s. You can see this is more what it looks like under contemporary conditions, much denser forest stand. And so what we're talking about is this situation being the desirable, and this, at least with respect to water supply, and this being sort of the more contemporary situation, and can we provide incentives to go back? And we showed basically that the onset of very high levels of pine tree density, pine leaf area index, happened really in the 1960s and 70s, right? There's been some incremental additions since with modern silvicultural treatments, but the big change was between the early period in the 1930s and 40s and 1965. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip to the chase here, which is that, we see this increase in leaf area index. So this is a reconstructed leaf area index time series that combines aerial imagery and satellites. And we see that manifesting across nearly 100 years of data. This is a map of the Bradford Forest. These dark areas are all the wetlands. Wetlands are hotspots for biomass and for evaporation. don't think anybody is advocating that the wetlands be forest reduced. The wetlands serve lots of functions, but suffice to say they are water hogs as well. And want to key in here on this particular point, which is that we're seeing over time an increase of leaf area index on the order of about a hundredth of an LAI unit per year, which over this nearly century of record corresponds to nearly a unit of LAI increase. And so when I said earlier that a unit of LAI corresponds to 50 million gallons per day over the Worthington Springs Basin, that's approximately the increase in leaf area that has occurred over the last century. We've also seen, this is in particular, this blue is this Bradford forest. You can see this is the period over which our experiment is run, and you can see the leaf area index has been substantially decreased by the experiment that we've been running. I'm going to go ahead and skip over these things a little bit because I want to show you some key things, and somehow I've let the time get away from me. We can predict the leaf area index and by extension the water yield across the entirety of North Florida. This is a product that Katie Glodzik, who's a postdoc in my lab, has produced. We published it a year ago. This map is super useful because it enables us to go to any place and ask what is the water yield currently under the forest management that's occurring there, and by extension, if we were to alter the management scheme of that forest, what would be the additional water supply that we would enable. And so I want to just call out this figure for a couple things. One is the skill that it took to make a figure that you can visualize more or less the entire landscape. I'll just note that anytime you see a color, that's a pixel in the landscape where the model is eligible to be applied, right? It's a forest. All the gray areas, I mean, you can see Jacksonville here and you can see Orlando down here. These are places where the model would not be applicable, but there's a lot of area where we can use the logic of this water yield tool to make predictions. When we sum up across this whole landscape, this is a histogram of the water yield. The median water yield is about 23 centimeters per year, which turns out to be the amount of water that Florida gives back to the sea every year, roughly 25 centimeters per year. And so this number aligns super well with what we observe in terms of total river flow. So earlier I was saying, well, if we do all this water yield, is it going to show up at the gauge? This would be the first clue that the answer to that is yes, because we can take the predictions at the whole landscape scale, and the predictions that they make correspond very strongly right here to what we see coming out in the rivers. And I think that's we're just trying to build confidence in the tools we're building so that when we apply them, we apply them with confidence that they actually are going to tell us the right answer. Because there's a lot of steps in this enterprise. In particular, the utilization of satellite remote sensing. This is data from Landsat. This is a satellite that's been in various forms, has been in space since 1985. We can detect the composition and structure of the forest from Landsat really well, and there are better products even than Landsat. They don't go back as far, but they enable us to interrogate from space basically everything we want to know about the forest that is useful for making hydrological predictions. And we can detect the seasonality, we can detect the spatial heterogeneity, we can detect a harvest quite readily. And so you can see, for example, in this setting, these areas are unharvested. This area down here is a stand that had been recently harvested, and we can detect that in terms of low leaf area index. And so we can interrogate this whole thing from space. We don't need somebody on the ground telling us what a landowner is doing with regard to their leaf area index, which makes the implementation of a program where money is changing hands between an enterprise like a utility that wants a consumptive use permit and the landowner that's willing to grow less pine trees. The operational implementation of that is made much, much simpler because we can basically track the whole process from space. All right. One of the questions that we had is that much of this landscape is full of embedded wetlands. So these are wetlands that, if you follow the Waters of the United States rule, this is the Sackett decision, essentially nationally, federally invalidated the Clean Water Act protections of these wetlands. they are super abundant in these flatwoods. There are thousands and thousands of these embedded wetlands. And our question was, as we shift the landscape from very dense pines and limes to some new regime for silviculture, what are the consequences in terms of the water in the wetlands? This is a question that David, I know, and David and I both have been trying to get answers to. This was really the first time we had the opportunity to systematically interrogate that question. And so what we have are 50 wetlands. Each one of these red dots is a wetland with a water level recorder in the wetland, hopefully, usually in the deepest part of the wetland. You can see the wetlands are all pretty correlated. The water levels are responding to the weather, right? So this is a hydrograph showing the water level in the wetland over time. The black is the long-term average, or the average across all of them. They all are responding to largely the same weather events, but they're not exactly the same. And in particular, what happens after a harvest is that the water levels in the wetland shift. And so what we have, because we have these many wetlands across the landscape, we have some that exist in a setting where nothing changed. Rainier harvested nothing. Those are around 20 wetlands. And then we have 20 wetlands that were logged to various degrees in the region around the wetland. This is one of the wetlands where there you can see the sort of kidney-shaped wetland, and then you can see that wetland 2 years later as the land has been harvested and bedded for the next rotation of pine stems. And so that allows us to compare what happened in those two wetlands over time. And so what we have is a kind of before and after, right? We have this wetland, which has a before and after that's quite dramatic. The adjacent upland was harvested. And we have a reference wetland where the before and after is unchanged, and we can compare their responses. And so in the time before logging, the two wetlands are shown here. Black is the logged wetland, blue is the reference wetland. They're not identical. They're doing roughly the same thing, but they're not identical. And then after the logging, we can see a relationship where the gold data, which is the logged site after the uplands were harvested, what happened to the water level. We can plot one versus the other. This is the leaf area index of those two sites. You can see overall the leaf area index was going down. This is a consequence of the drought for the most part, right? These pine trees are able to sustain lower leaf area because it's been so dry. But one of the sites was leaf area was actively removed. We removed pine trees. And we see that these are all satellite data. This was not field data. So we can see very clearly when the wetland was harvested, or when the uplands were harvested, and we can track what happened to the wetland. Now can do this in 480 pairs because we have, or 380 pairs, I'm sorry, because we have each reference wetland can be compared to a logged wetland, and each logged wetland can be compared to a reference wetland, and we can compare the pre and post period. And what we get is a relationship that looks like this. This is one of the pairs. In fact, I think it's the pair I just showed you. The black line is showing the relationship between water level before we did anything. The gold line is showing the relationship after. And what is on the x-axis is the wetland where nothing happened, and on the y-axis, the wetland where the adjacent upland was logged. And what we can see is that the water levels are higher in the logged wetland after logging. So the gold dots in general are higher. The y-axis position is higher than in the reference wetland, which means that wetland is wetter. And that effect is most pronounced under low water levels, and under high water levels, it doesn't really matter. And the reason for that is each one of these wetlands is a little teacup in the landscape. And when the teacup is full, you can't really put more water in it because it flows out and supporting stream flow. And so at the lip of the teacup, doesn't matter how much evaporation is reduced, you basically can't get the water level any higher. But that loss of evaporation in the adjacent landscape means that the water levels in the wetlands that were logged are now much higher. And we can summarize that across all of the wetlands and show that for every unit LAI reduction, we increase the water in the wetlands about 4 inches. So 4 inches of increased water level in the wetlands where the leaf area index in the adjacent uplands was reduced by 1 unit. I said earlier that that was the number that we saw in our big model, and so that number showing up in the wetlands as well as in the at the stand level gives us some confidence that that number is actually operationally useful. Like it could guide a decision system. Um, I'll also note that the ditches in this landscape really modify that relationship. So many of the wetlands historically looked like this. There are little teacups, little depressions in the landscape. You can see that the blue colors are lower elevation. You can see they're surrounded by higher altitude land. This is where the pine trees would be grown. But a lot of them back in the 1970s, the landscape was largely excavated to try to get rid of water. And so these ditches are like a spider web across the entire landscape. And those ditches are affect the extent to which we see this effect show up. And so when the wetlands look like this, that relationship with leaf area index is very strong. When the wetlands have been ditch connected, that effect is much more muted. All right, I'm going to just rush through this because it basically tells the same story. Each one of these red dots is a stream that we've been tracking for now 5 years. We have measured the flow at each one of them, and we can, and each one of them was subject to different levels of forest management. In particular, this basin right up here was, they focused a lot of their harvesting effort in this basin. So this basin saw a really big reduction in leaf area index. This basin, basin number 3, they didn't do anything. They didn't touch it at all. And so because we have this partner, this Rainier partner, they're able to do things that there's just no way that I as an individual university investigator could do an experiment at this scale. So again, I just want to say that this partnership with the timber company is super important. So each one of these places is a basin. I'll just note that we're also interested in Brook Sink. Brook Sink is a extraordinarily impressive sinkhole that is situated right here. And the district is quite interested in using this direct connection between the surface and the Floridan aquifer at the sinkhole at Brook Sink to get water in the aquifer. The watersheds were quite variable in terms of their impact, but you can see 3 basins over here were largely untouched. There was no harvesting, and a couple of the basins were harvested quite intensively. And so again, we have this experimental comparison between a watershed where a lot of timber was removed versus one that wasn't. This is exactly where the timber was removed and when. And so we have a really good record to track when these changes happened. We measured the flow. These are super flashy streams, right? You can see this is the discharge measured in liters per second, but you can see how flashy it is. This is very typical of the flatwoods. The flatwoods are, they basically don't flow very often. They flow really only when the water level is high enough to activate all those wetland teacups spilling out into the stream network. And so they're quite challenging to work in. This is another hydrograph showing the shape of the hydrological response. So what we thought about is like, well, let's not focus on the individual daily flows. We're interested in tracking the cumulative flows. And what we found was that in many of the places, we saw this relationship where in the pre-harvest period, there was one relationship between the amount of, this is for rainfall. I'm going to go ahead and skip this. There's really 2 epochs to this project. Whenever you do a project in the real world, you're subject to the fact that you can't control the rain. And so in the early period through the end of 2022, so the first 2 years of the project, it was really rainy. And in the second part of the project, it was really dry. And that colors everything about what we expect to see, what we did see. Water yield varies substantially across the different watersheds. We see the overall water yields for the entire forest is on the order of about 9 inches per year, whereas at Worthington Springs, it's more like 10 inches per year. This is then the tracking of the forest cover, like we were able to interrogate what Rainier is doing. And this basin right here is the one that I said was harvested quite heavily. There were other basins. This one right here was harvested heavily. This one right here is the basin that I said was unharvested. And so we have this intercomparison between different basins that lets us do things like think about how the water supply from the stream or the water flow in the stream was altered. And I want to just jump to this graph right here because this is really sort of the key slide. And that is that when we plot the leaf area index of the basin averaged over the entire 4-year period against the water yield, we get this relationship. The low leaf area watersheds, the streams, had high water yield. The high leaf area, lots of forest density, had low water yield. And if we look at the slope of that line, this is in millimeters, it's about 120 millimeters per unit LAI, which corresponds almost exactly to our expectations of 4 inches of additional water yield per unit LAI. So I know this is like way too much information, but I want to just bring it home in like a clear way. When we look at the individual forest stand, reducing leaf area index by 1 unit increases recharge by about 4 inches. When we look at the individual wetlands, when we reduce leaf area in the adjacent uplands, it increases the water level in the wetland by about 4 inches. And when we look at the stream level, we look at, now integrated across many thousands of acres of the landscape, and we ask about a unit reduction in leaf area, we get about 4 inches of additional water yield. And so that number is robust. I think it's a number that we can essentially advocate for in terms of operational implementation of programs and incentives. So some conclusions. We basically previously showed that there's water in the woods and we can make more of it available by managing forest density. The forest density in the upper Santa Fe River Basin has increased dramatically. And the water yield has also declined as we would expect, but the timing actually makes it very complicated. I didn't really get a chance to talk about that, but that's an important point. When we manage the adjacent forest around the wetlands, they respond quite readily to the hydrological response of the wetlands is strong, on the order of 4 inches again. And when we look at the stream flows, we get, again, the same response. And so if we're thinking about recommendations, again, this was made directly to the Water Management District Governing Board. Evapotranspiration is the largest part of the water budget. When you think about water supply planning, the pumping parts, the low flow toilets, all of those are they're critical pieces of water supply planning and conservation planning, but managing evapotranspiration is by far the gallons gallons in terms of what we should at least consider in terms of water supply planning is managing evapotranspiration. And historically, Florida's forests would have evaporated far less of the water than today's contemporary forests do. And so can we create incentives that would help meet the MFLs by providing or enable a utility that needs water for their municipal permits? Could they essentially offset their water by creating a monetary payment to landowners to reduce their pine densities? And I think that it is imminent that we're going to try this out on a pilot scale to see if this works. Are the contracts viable? Does it actually generate are there blind alleys that we haven't really thought about? The water quality impacts of all that additional recharge are super important. We haven't quantified this enough, but all of that additional water is offsetting some of the contamination issues with respect to meeting the concentration targets of our BMAPs. And so I think thinking about forests as part of the water quality solution, I think is also really quite important. And ultimately, that when we think about water supply planning in an integrative sense, whether it includes a project like Water First North Florida, or it includes water caution areas, or includes things like restrictions on consumptive use permits, managing the landscape and the evapotranspiration on the landscape is one of the tools, one of the levers we have to pull when we think about integrated water supply planning. And so this is another thank you slide. I guess at this point, I'll stop and maybe stop sharing as well, and ask if there are any questions. I saw the chat sort of working its way through here, but maybe people can paraphrase. I don't have to read them all.
Joanne had one, which is your area is right near Stark, Florida, which has had some big problems with floods during heavy rain. So she's wondering how your model integrates flooding potential.
Yeah, well, I mean, one consequence of raising the water table, which is the outcome of reducing evaporation, is that if that happens and you get 15 inches of rain dumped on you from a tropical system, that you could exacerbate flooding. And I think that's a really important consideration, right? So it's not just, it's not just about the average water supply. It's about the timing of that water supply and the consequences for flooding. Now, Stark is upstream of the Bradford Forest. So the consequences of doing this in Bradford Forest would not be impactful on Stark, but it could be impactful on flood risk in other parts of the river. For the most part, changing the water table doesn't affect the water flows at high discharge nearly as much as it affects the water flows at low discharge. And that's because what mostly controls the water flows at high discharge is the total amount of rainfall. Like you can't mitigate, like there's having forests or not having forests really doesn't affect the runoff when you get a 10-inch daily rainfall. What altering the forest density really mostly alters the base flow. And since a lot of our aquatic habitats have challenges with regard to meeting some of these base flow targets, right? Because and a lot of the organisms that depend on the upper Santa Fe or the Flint River are at risk under low flows, it's likely that the ecological benefit to the river, at least, could be substantial, particularly once you start thinking about like organisms for which a river drying out is problematic.
Well, and of course, in the Springs heartland of Florida, it's not just the rivers that needed replenishing, it's the aquifer itself. I forget if I mentioned to you, Dennis James Price's proposal, he's been floating since about 2016, which is, as you mentioned, these planted pine plantations, they have ditches inside them, they're often ditched. And what if you have them go to wetlands, which many of them do already, and then have aquifer recharge wells at the overflow of the wetlands? Then in heavy rains, the overflow would go into the aquifer and not cause flooding.
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, this whole project started with that exact premise. This was back in 2000 and roughly 2020, where we thought we could mobilize water into Lake Sampson. Lake Sampson would be the reservoir, and you could routinely pump water down a supply, or like invert the trajectory of the flow. So rather than pulling water out, you would be putting water in. And we could show that all that additional water that you'd be putting in wouldn't be robbing Lake Sampson, because we could show that it was actually generated from the additional water yield from the woods. And that was shut down. It's illegal. You can't put water in the aquifer until you treat it to drinking water standards. And drinking water standards include removing the color to, I think it's like 2 platinum cobalt units. And so because natural wetlands and pine forests in the coastal plain produce high color water, it's actually illegal to put that water into the aquifer intentionally.
Oh yes, I remember. I did mention it because you brought that up. Illegal by Florida state law or federal law?
Well, it was an FDP interpretation. Which exact law? Probably state law, because I don't believe that the Clean Water Act controls that. But it's a good question, and yes, I mean, and apparently this has been adjudicated. I'm not a lawyer, but but and it's also why, by the way, the Water Management District is so interested in Brook Sink, because Brook Sink is a natural connection between the surface and the subsurface, and so you can augment discharge to Brook Sink without running afoul of the aquifer protection laws. And so they have been leaning into that, but they can't do that elsewhere because there's not sinkholes like that elsewhere.
Well, they've talked about putting it into Falling Creek Sink as well.
Yeah, I think if you have a natural sinkhole, you can reroute water to that, then that would be a solution.
You just clarified something. As you're aware, the Water First North Florida project plans to put treated wastewater into wetlands. They claim they don't know where the projected wetlands are, but given the first map they published, several of those locations look awfully near some of those natural sinks. So, yeah, I got to wonder, do they not really know? But in any case, interesting correlation to look into. We'll see what we can find.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the recharge location matters. Obviously anyways, the recharge location would matter substantially for us in this project. It's proximity to existing self-supply wells that really activated the concerns about aquifer recharge, and so I think it's 70 within 350 feet of the recharge well, and so anyways, this is a bit of ancient history. I might have the numbers a little bit wrong, but yeah, you should. I think that's it's a little bit ironic because in some ways you could make the case that recharging the aquifer with surface water has some important sustainability benefits with regard to water supply planning, but we have a water quality constraint on that. And I think it is quite interesting, the analogy between that and the Water First North Florida, right? Putting 40 million gallons per day in the aquifer is a good thing. I think categorically a good thing. The concerns about water quality ends up being sort of an important constraint on whether that is going to have the desired effect or not. But we're already taking the water out, and so my case in the context of the Santa Fe project, what we did was that was one hand not understanding what the other hand was doing, and so constraining our ability to recharge the Floridan felt bureaucratic and not hydrological.
Yes. And as far as Water First North Florida, they claim they can get all the PFAS, forever chemicals, and pharmaceuticals out of it, but that's a big research project that they have no conclusion to yet. And as far as, if it really is a state law about the color, as I think I mentioned when we talked before, JEA managed to get a loophole into a state law to allow Water First North Florida anyway. It's possible to change state.
They are removing a lot of the color. I mean, this was also the issue with the pumping up from was it Deep Creek, the 10 MGD that they're pumping up to Lake Geneva. They had to remove the color prior to that as well.
So how are they doing that?
It's oh boy, it is they run it through a treatment wetland, but I don't think that the treatment wetland is doing most of the work on that front. And so, yeah, I'd have to look into it. I don't know off the top of my head what the tech is, but that is a constraint. That was a major constraint on that project getting authorized. So.
Right. Well, the major point is it's known how to do it, and one would suspect doing that for a bunch of wetlands below planted pine forest would cost a lot less than $1 billion.
Yeah, I mean, those are exactly the kinds of questions I think that merit attention, right? Like, what would it cost to do this, and in the decision space, are there less expensive alternatives?
Combining it with what you're basically proposing, then one, as you already pointed out to the district board, that would be more water than Water First North Florida.
Right.
There seem to be a lot of
have to look more.
Go ahead.
I'll have to look more into the color standards. It seems a little unfortunate to me that there's so much emphasis, and that color is such a hindrance whenever we get so much tannic inflow, backflow into the aquifer naturally. It's just part of life here. And especially, I mean, I have to quote Aquifer Watch's director, Rick. He's always saying, if you're not monitoring, you're not managing. And so with regards to water first and the PFAS, and pharmaceuticals, and a whole slew of other things. It's apparent that they're only going to be testing for drinking water standards. So yeah, I kind of wish it was the color was could be a little more mysterious and that the other things were more obvious, but that's not the case.
Right.
Joanne, do you want to ask your question?
My question about the effects of reduction of evapotranspiration on localized rainfall.
Yes, that one.
Okay. I don't think it's within the confines of your research. I was just wondering whether you were aware of any correlation between reduction of evapotranspiration and localized rainfall. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's I think a very important concern. When you think about continental scale hydrological or climate systems, like I think the Amazon is the best example. The water that rains in the interior of the Amazon, up in the Andes, is not water that was recently seawater, right? It's water that has been recycled multiple times, as the air moves inland. And so if you think about the rainfall in one place as being the evaporation in some place that's upwind, then if you reduce the evaporation in that place upwind, then you potentially impact the rainfall. And I think that's maybe the essence of your question. Like, would we be adjusting the rainfall patterns locally because of the reduction in evapotranspiration? And I think the answer is locally in some places. On Earth, the answer is unequivocally yes. In Florida, we can look at the isotopic composition of the rainfall and conclude that nearly all of the rain that falls on Florida was evaporated from the ocean, in which case that doesn't really matter, right? Because that evaporation is gonna, like, we're not affecting evaporation off the ocean. But there are places where that's not true. And so it makes this solution, I think, quite viable in our context and not nearly as viable in other contexts. And it's an important question because I think it was the one that, we need an answer to, so that we don't inadvertently do something, that compromises our hydrological system by, being a little myopic. So yeah, thank you. It's a very important question.
So the idea is to reduce trees in order to reduce the LAI to get this extra evaporation, correct? In the hope that it will increase rainfall?
It won't, not so much to adjust the rainfall, but it will, that you reduce leaf area index, which reduces the evaporation. Now that water's got to go someplace else, right? It used to go, or not used to, it can go one of two places. It can go to streams and aquifers and wetlands and the sea, to the springs, or it can go back to the atmosphere. And the trees are the decision point about where the raindrops go. And so if we reduce the density of the trees, we move more of the water in the direction of recharge and springs flow and stream flow and wetland storage. And as we increase the trees, we tilt the balance in the opposite direction, where we make more of the raindrops go to the atmosphere.
And so then decreasing the trees and that to increase the evaporation. And then there's a financial incentive to do that. Is that the proposal, that to help change the land in this way?
Yeah, exactly. Planted pine doesn't irrigate at all, right? They're entirely rain fed. There's no, so there's
I'm
no
more interested in the incentive. I'm concerned because in New Jersey, there was a big move to take down old growth because new growth forests, increases a different biodiversity. And it turned out to be a bit of perverse incentive because the people would get paid to cut down the old growth, and there was plenty of new growth forest anyway. It outnumbered it, if you see what I'm saying. So I get what you're proposing and how that could increase the water supply to rivers and streams. And apparently the science is really good that it will, although it's untested. But I'm wondering, like kind of like I'm working this follow the money approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think the first point to make is that when we think about old growth in Florida, it's not lots of trees, right? What we consider like the reference old growth forest in Florida is actually very few trees. You know,
Yeah,
fact,
I was only using that as like a correlation, not as
right.
like I'm concerned about old growth. I'm concerned about the proposal being used for lands that are not currently farmed or not currently I'm concerned about it using it in good faith for forest management and not for incentive to cut down trees. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I'd like to sort of unpack that with you a little bit. So when you say, and it is an incentive to cut down trees, it's incentive to manage the forest at a lower leaf area, which unequivocally means cutting down trees. And so when you think about a perverse incentive, which does show up a lot of times in these payments for ecosystem services, where people are incentivized to do things that are actually not good, right? I think the goal with any program like this would be to incentivize the retention of the land in managed forest, as opposed to what's happening right now across basically all of North Florida, is that managed forest is being converted to suburbs. And why is that? Well, I mean, the business model for forestry is part of the issue, but if they could generate a revenue stream that's in support of an ecosystem services like water yield, then it might tilt the balance in favor of preserving that land cover type with its other attendant benefits. Are there going to be circumstances in which people view this as a way to take forests that they don't intend to manage for production pine, and convert those to parking lots? I don't think so. I mean, certainly in a vacuum, you could say that, right? Like you could turn the forests into Teflon coated, that would generate a lot of water yield. But I don't think the payments would be like, it would have to be a continuing forestry operation in the same way that all the BMPs for forestry presume a continuing forestry operation. I think that would have to be part of it. And in fact, you can sort of spy on them from satellites, so like any party to a contract like that could
Well, I guess that's my concern is the implementation. And of course, I'm not going to spy on them from a satellite. But what government agency would, and how would that be regulated? It seems like there's a lot of loopholes for people to go in and say, I could get in there and harvest these trees now because we need to thin the forest to save the water.
Yeah. And my reply would be that that's actually doing exactly that. I'm not going to question their motives, but I do think that part of the contractual arrangement would have to include some provisions that this is a continuing forestry operation, right? And not just the last rotation, right, before we turn it into a subdivision, for example.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me be here and speak.
No, it's great. I mean, I think these are, it doesn't exist yet, right? Like a pilot program doesn't even exist yet. And so it's unclear whether forest landowners are going to be interested in getting paid. Like they might not want anything to do with this. It may be that the price that they get paid is not enough to really offset the reduced timber production revenue, right? Right now, the stumpage price of timber is so low that they're suffering. One consequence of reducing forest biomass supply via government program would be now the mills close. And if the mills close, then everybody's business is. So there's a lot of things to navigate in terms of the sort of economic ripple effects of something like this. And it may be that people just don't have the appetite for it. But the hydrological science, I think, is really well supported. And so I think if we're interested in water supply planning, this is a tool that we would like to make sure is in the toolkit of people who are having to make complicated decisions like that.
Well,
Thank you, Matthew.
as you know, mills are closing anyway. It's a big problem.
It is a big problem.
And that's partly because, or at least exacerbated by all the hurricane damage. So, I would suspect what you're talking about, if there are actually reasonable payments for it, would be reasonably popular. And I think of it in the I grow trees myself. I think of it in the context of the usual rotation, which is, as maybe some of you are not familiar with, they like to clear cut, plant pretty dense, after 15 years, thin, after 15 years, thin, after another 15 years, clear cut again. So what we're talking about in that context is basically wait for the replanting for a year or two. I believe you mentioned that as a possibility, or thin earlier, or just don't plant quite as dense in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've been quite adamant about is that I think the decision about how to meet an LAI target should be left up to the landowner. And that we don't want to be technocratic and come in and tell somebody how to grow pine trees when that's their business. So I told the Water Management District Governing Board, don't get in the business of telling people how to do their thing. Tell them that their expectation is you should meet a mean LAI over this stand of 2 over the next 15 years. And if you do, here's your payments. And if you don't, you won't get paid. And we can tell. You can't lie about your LAI, is what I say, because we can basically follow it from satellites. And so I don't want to get in the business of prescribing what constitutes the appropriate rotational structure, like when to harvest, how densely to harvest. Those are decisions that are best left up to people who know their land, I think.
Well, of course, tree farmers are used to being told what to do. The Conservation Reserve Program is relatively specific about what you can do, how much you should plant, 15-year thinning and so forth. But there is some leeway. It doesn't have to be exactly 15 years. The anecdote that I'm not going to say in length is we did 21 acres of Conservation Reserve Program. And because it was a former cotton field, the opposite of what Jody's concerned about, we did have to spray to get rid of the Bermuda grass. But since then, we haven't sprayed at all. We do prescribed burns. And how this is relevant specifically to Matt's project is we hired somebody to plant, and they planted too soon after the initial spraying, and it appeared all the trees died. So we went out there and hand planted, the two of us and two assistants, 12,000 trees, longleaf pines. And then about a third of the original ones came up. So it was just way too dense. And we did, in fact, delay thinning because given that all the appropriate operations have been busy dealing with salvaging after the hurricane, we just couldn't get anybody for a couple of years. But now it's thinned a lot, so that helps with lower leaf index. So that's my anecdote.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very sort of boutique, like that 21 acres had a particular story. I think we have to allow every 21 acre parcel to have its story, and not.
Yes.
My worry is that if we get too technocratic and tell people how to do it, they won't bother. They won't be interested.
Oh, yeah. Well, I sure do appreciate you giving this talk. Sounds like a lot of other people do too.
Yeah, I think it's a good forum. I hope you guys weren't too overwhelmed. That was a lot of content.
As you know, we will post the Zoom video. If you want to, you can send your slides. We'll post them accompanying it, or you don't have to.
No, I'm fine with that. It was should be public domain because I've already shared it with the Water Management District. So
Okay, well, if you want to send the slides, then we will include those when we post the video.
very good.
Haley, what you got to say? You're muted. She's still muted. Okay, it was Haley Hall's idea to invite Matt, and I think it was a great idea. So thank you, Haley, for inviting him. Thank you, Matt, for giving this talk and doing all this research. And thanks to everyone else, including there were a bunch more people who turned into a puff of smoke around about the hour. Thanks to all the attendees as well.
Very good. Take care, y'all. Good
All
luck.
right. Toodaloo, tally ho.